The talk that I wanted to give today is certainly a lot about the work that I've done in a number of the kind of organizations and projects that Jillian described. I also just wanted to note that, hopefully this is okay, I just wanted to note that part of the work that I'm most interested in is like creating infrastructures that operate differently than things we might normally encounter. So Broken City Lab is a structure, Neighborhood Time Exchange is a structure, the School for Eventual Vacancy is a structure. These are projects I'll talk about today. But I'm interested in how smaller communities, whether in terms of geography or whether in terms of just like a small number of people coming together, can articulate a different form of agency and a different way to be in the world based on organizing themselves in other forms. And often those forms need to be in response to existing or dominant modes of operation. But the key thing that comes out of working maybe in opposition is not like an ongoing anger, but really a way to understand that the world is malleable, even when it's not always asking you to mold it. And I guess I wanted to, so I think I also wanted to kind of talk about work that is producing unanticipated consequences, I guess. And oftentimes, if we expect art to do things that it's not normally asked to do, that can sound risky, or it can sound like dangerous, or maybe it can even sound uninteresting, or like it's not art anymore. But I'm kind of, I'm interested in how that work can be supported, and even when it falls down, that there's always an opportunity to try again and fall down again, I guess. So I realized once I was kind of thinking through this, and I don't know if I mean that art is the guy falling or what, but it just strikes me that there's even the best intentions, and especially when we're talking about community-engaged art, even the best intentions can sometimes derail. And so maybe we can talk a little bit today about how we can avoid falling into pools. Okay, so making impossible demands is really about asking, I think, of yourself in the place that you're in, asking how could this be different, right? And making a demand that is knowingly unfulfillable. There's this scholar, Simon Critchley, who writes about impossible demands as kind of an ethical baseline, where it's this thing that can never be fulfilled. It's kind of this constant relationship and dynamic you need to something that can never be addressed, but it's the working towards that creates an ethical framework. So it's not about solving it, it's about a commitment, and a never-ending commitment to addressing the thing. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Windsor, Ontario. Who's been through southwestern Ontario, across the Ambassador Bridge? Who's spent time there? Okay, fewer, right? Yeah, okay. So it is a great place to go through. Maybe the border itself looks familiar. This is the tunnel. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the stories that Windsor tells itself and tells other people visiting it, partially through architecture. I think that this kind of scene says a lot about the kind of city Windsor is. And I'll walk you through it that there's the most Canadian-esque we're willing to be is like half of a maple leaf. It's kind of like we're not even full-on Canadian. It's like, don't worry, safe zone. It's just creeping to the top. We have a line of cars as kind of as a memorial to our failed auto industry, and we have international brands that are welcome into the city. It wasn't always the case. In the 60s, there was this really compelling book that imagined Windsor as a garden gateway to Canada. And you wonder about these kinds of moments in time when there was another imagination that was possible. And as that gets eroded or kind of forgotten about, it's just like really amazing to imagine, like, what if the city operated from here, right? Like, what if this had been the game plan? Like, how much different would that have been? And this clearly, that this book existed was never like a formal plan. It was a provocation. It was asking what if, right? So the story that's now more official are things like this. Windsor is a toxic ground zero. Windsor is not a happy place. And even though I'm in Vancouver, I still kind of like I check in on the Windsor Star, once a week or so, just to like see what the story is. On a more kind of like social media, this is something one of my students produced once when I was teaching at Windsor, and this is like something that somebody spent a lot of time doing, thinking about Windsor, and I guess, it's just like, so I don't know what exactly this means, but I do know that it took a lot of effort to go and get the pack of printer paper and design this thing, lay it out in Microsoft Word. You printed many of these and put them up. Like, that takes effort to just be like, I am unhappy. And so whether or not I agree with this is another question, but I think that that sensibility of wanting to do something that says, like, I am unsatisfied with what's going on here is kind of important. And Broken City Lab came out of that sort of question we were asking ourselves, like, well, what is there to do here? How can we act? The city doesn't ask anything of us. There's not really a clear role that people in their early 20s might take in like a kind of mid-sized city that has no real employment opportunities for people who graduate. I lost so many friends moving to places like Toronto and Vancouver, and then eventually even like we were so dedicated, my partner and I, and yet we still had to leave. And I'm not sure what that means either. Like, I'm just like post-traumatic stress. Like, we got a house, we're like have family around, it was perfect, and then like there was no longer-term employment. So that's not something that Broken City Lab tries to address, but together with these really incredible folks over 8 or 9 years, we started asking, what do you do in a city like Windsor? And when this is the story from Detroit, if you're on the waterfront, and this is what the Windsor waterfront looks like. And it's really, it's pretty dim except for this kind of bright, shiny casino that at some point was like an economic development plan that kind of didn't really pay off, right? I think maybe you're familiar with similar schemes. But I'll say that it struck us that you can really read that Caesar sign from across the border, right? And that's kind of interesting. So we wondered how big that was and how we might say something equally as large. And so we took a projector and some gear, and we started sending other messages across the border that weren't just Caesar's, but were really about trying to imagine a different relationship with this city that, like our parents used to go over and go dancing and, go to clubs and stuff like that. And there was a point at which that wasn't viable either. So we're trying to sort of rediscover what that relationship is. And importantly, I'll say that we were not, we didn't like line up a whole bunch of people to say, hey, what do you want to say to Detroit? It was like, there was, I think this night, like, my car was parked over there, and there's probably like 4 of us up there. Like, nobody like saw this, and that's not really kind of what it was, right? It was about us sort of imagining ourselves at a different scale of what we might want to say, and it was really for us. From Detroit, you could read it if you happen to be in Hart Plaza, but I'm not sure that there were many people, and that's okay, because that sort of thinking opens up a whole bunch of other opportunities. You start looking at the city as a series of maybe like blanks waiting to be filled in. We worked with this one. We kind of opened up to participation. Our transit system isn't very heavily used, and there were advertisements that were very outdated in there. We thought, working off of a strategy a number of other artists have, we invited community members to basically send us in things that they might want to say to caption the city as you move by, and we worked with transit to kind of put these in. We also have done billboards, looking at the kind of narratives that we tell ourselves about a city. This project kind of spanned into other locations, but what I find really interesting about it is, this is specific as soon as it's somewhere, right? And as soon as someone from that location, from that community reads it, and they find something in their experience of the place that resonates with what this is. Right? So you might be able to locate any number of moments at which this happens, but there's also not any one moment that's universal for everybody. And the ability to kind of tease out these sorts of cycles of narratives, and by the way, this was in Calgary, right, in 2010 or 11. And so I don't know, I'm just curious about how this kind of provocation as something that's both like an articulation of your own agency in a place and something that resonates differently with other people becomes not like a universal model, but becomes maybe a method for doing something where you live. Near the, I guess I'll say a year before I left for Vancouver, we opened up this project called Civic Space, which was funded by the Ontario Trillium Foundation. And really, it was an amazing thing to work with them, because this was the first time that that foundation had kind of funded what was effectively a sort of a pop-up artist-run center. The Trillium Foundation is very good at helping to put like new roofs on hockey arenas and kind of building out capacity in existing community organizations. But we basically started a not-for-profit to run this project that was trying to look at like basically looking at like other roles that artists could play in communities as leaders, right? So we imagined that we had some like stake that was maybe beyond our pay grade in the city to start bringing people to the community and trying to organize other folks who are already in town around ideas, conversations that we wanted to have that weren't necessarily about art or design, but were about looking at new and expanded roles that artists and designers could play in cities beyond what was expected of us. And these engagement projects were kind of also invitations to ask other people to start playing with the city around them. So when we opened the letter library, you could come and basically borrow letters, which were cut out of styrofoam. So there was a few hundred letters. They were very light, and they kind of looked something like what you might see on a municipal building that was built in like maybe the late 80s through the 2000s. There's like Helvetica Bold as sort of the font. It says very clearly like City Hall or whatever. So you could come out and stack, they're very light, and you could tape them to anything with masking tape. You also got one of these cameras, and you got to go out and caption, again, the city in ways that you wanted. This was by a homeless youth that would often come and hang out with us during the winter, and so he came and participated. It was sort of like the first spring project, and he went out and captioned this bank. This is, I won't say like these, I won't say like, okay, these are examples of great art or anything. It's not really about that. It's more like this was, for a lot of people, maybe the first time they had ever like done something to the city. And that's really, I think that opens up a different approach that we have to where we live. And so this was a really exciting way to kind of open up the space, and we continued to do many sort of like workshops that explored how we might renegotiate an existing relationship with the city. We also did sort of like design jams around sort of like new branding for the city or new narratives that we might tell ourselves. We tried to figure out how kind of familiar forms of communication might be redeployed. We did, a lot of this stuff doesn't look particular to Windsor, but what was great is that it was maybe happening in some ways for the first time. And I don't want to say that we alone in any way kind of laid the only groundwork, but I will say that like things like these kind of screen printing shops, like there's now a kind of an artist-run print shop outside of the Printmakers Forum that's running. And there's like Windsor Hack Forge is also kind of ramped up activities, and they're a much more kind of vital force. So we weren't like incubating these things, but I think we were starting to ask like, this could exist, right? This could totally happen here. Why doesn't it? Kind of like from the ground planning projects that connected people over time. We asked people to give us one thing they regret and one thing they're resolved to do about that regret at the end of 2011, and we got 2 copies of the shirt. So there's like 50 shirts 50 different shirts that all say I resolve, and so you might bump into somebody in the community and realize that you were part of this project and not have to kind of like say anything, but you have this like point of connection. And these projects that were really accessible in a way that didn't make us lose interest, but were really about trying to say like this doesn't have to be read as an art project, this is just about like how we might want to be differently together. Working with an artist, Jason Sturgill from Portland, we did a free tattoo day called Windsors Forever. Artists made kind of flash art of symbols of Windsor. So we have a salt mine in Windsor, so a salt shaker. And you could come in, line up all day and get free tattoos of one of these symbols. And it was kind of it was moving in a way because this was when we started working in 2008, and this was, I think, about 2012, it would have been difficult to imagine that anyone would want to like have a permanent reminder that they're from Windsor, right? But by in 4 years later, it's like all of a sudden this becomes a sort of like this is an interesting place to live. It's hard, but it's interesting. Activating the outdoor space and kind of just this was a really interesting anchor for us and a way to work on a project for a long time. When we had been doing these pop-up things, this was a 2-year concentration and many activities, and it wrapped up with the Best of Awards, which we kind of figured that like maybe our work was done because you could nominate anybody for being the best at anything, and we had a night where you would get a trophy and you could give a speech, kind of like acceptance speech and all the stuff that would make you really appreciate the other person. And so we thought that was that was an appropriate kind of closing for Civic Space, because it meant that you didn't need us to tell you how interesting things were. You were kind of starting to make connections yourselves, I guess. So working in the Broken City Lab really brought to the forefront this question for me of like, so if it's not really legible as art, but if I can still be an artist doing it, or even when it is legible as art, but it's something that doesn't fit in kind of maybe predetermined spaces, you begin to wonder, well, like how far could you go? And this is what I was mentioning earlier about creating structures as kind of the project, right? Creating counterpoints to these existing sort of initiatives become really a compelling way to I guess, produce social engagement. So the Neighborhood Time Exchange was a proposition that came out of actually being really unhappy with some of the experiences we had as Broken City Lab and residencies, and also being unsure and frankly quite skeptical about the forms that community engaged art normally takes. And this isn't to suggest a critique of things like community arts or even more legible forms of kind of maybe socially engaged public art, but it's just to say that like we thought there could be a different way to approach it. We proposed that in exchange, so I'll back up and say in Detroit, you'll remember we're very close to Detroit, we saw a number of folks moving in, frankly white folks moving into African-American neighborhoods that were doing projects that seemed to be quite prescriptive and not really about the community that was there, but kind of about being heroic for an idea of like what a community should be. And that didn't really sit very well, and in instances when we had been invited to go to other places, it was difficult to kind of remount projects that we had done in Windsor that were very much about us. But when we went somewhere else, it had to be about who was there, because we didn't know enough about what was going on. But that created a challenging structure. So this was proposed kind of initially in a response to an invitation to work with Mural Arts Philadelphia. And we suggested that in a model where you could get a studio space, and for every hour you're in the studio, you have to give an hour back to the community. But the community decides what they want. So you don't give an hour back of like making a mural project, which is fine, but you basically like, they need help breaking their lawn, great. This is a different role that an artist could play. Now, the key thing is that the community is in the driver's seat in terms of like requesting where that time goes. And crucially, the artist also doesn't need to make community engaged art. You can basically go sit in your studio for half the time and they can go out and be public. And that division of time, I think, better represents the dynamics that are in play, which are you have a community that didn't ask for an art project necessarily, but they sometimes get one. And you have an artist who may not be super equipped or maybe even interested in doing community engaged art. And the composition of those, basically those two kind of positions come together to create, I think, something that continues to be a really great provocation. In West Philadelphia, which sounded more like the beginning of the theme song than I meant it to, but is where the first Neighborhood Time Exchange was located. And in the area, there's the encroachment of large universities, Drexel being maybe the most kind of imposing force, into a neighborhood that is increasingly being gentrified and long-term residents can no longer afford to be there. We located Neighborhood Time Exchange with a community anchor in the People's Emergency Center, which had started as a women's shelter 30 years ago and has since become a kind of basically a community developer building socially affordable housing. So the proposal was when you are doing your kind of community time in the studio, anyone can come in and ask you for any help, and we had forms that you would fill out, and it would give a basic idea, starting point for a longer conversation or negotiation about what we might do. And over time, that turned into like really sort of frontline work. So the local church needed new curtains. There was an artist in Betty who was doing kind of like lots of fabric work and textiles. And so she held like a kind of tie-dyeing party, and then they put up curtains in the church. This was Ian. He was a comic, like an illustrator, and there's a community organization that wanted a sort of like rendering of like a spot that they wanted to redevelop like in a decade from now. So they just want some early kind of free renderings, and so he provided that. There were folks who wanted to kind of digitize their like old home movies. So this was Philippe, and he basically held workshops with them for like pulling out the old 16mm Super 8 and putting it back together. Lots of more screen printing workshops, always a good thing. And then, you know, turning into community collaborations where the community came in and said, hey, we want to do like, we want to use this space as well. We don't want it to just be like this sort of like receiving place for our kind of to-do list. We want to come in and actually work with the artists. So these kinds of projects, masonry, yep, very. It was kind of really, it was great. It was challenging for the artists who felt like they sometimes were hard-pressed to have enough time to actually do this long-term, like every time a new project starts, you have to start a new conversation with someone you haven't met before. And so while this was a really, and I'll say that there were I think 3 Canadians in this project, and they got it like much faster than the Americans who were great, but it was not such a leap to be like, oh yeah, I'm an artist, I have these other skills, I could do something for the community here, and it wasn't this kind of big learning curve. So these are all just kind of community projects that came out of this process, working with a really kind of small and tight community around Lancaster Avenue, where the storefront was located. And you know, as time went on, more and more of this was led by the community members, and that, of course, became really exciting. And the storefront continues to kind of like house sort of like youth-led design projects. This was really, and I'll say that the other thing that happened in this project, which was kind of a bit of a prototype, and Mural Arts has taken a version of it and kind of continued on, and I'll show you in a minute about another version of the project I'm doing, but this was Macon Reed, and she worked with a elementary school for students on the autism spectrum. They had like a dedicated classroom, and she worked with them to like basically redesign and kind of like lightly renovate the space. And the teachers were super moved by what that transformation meant, both to their students and to their ability to work in there. But it also, like in an ideal version, this is really also like Macon's aesthetic, right? So it wasn't an art project, but it was, I think, really a really sort of responsible ask from the community partner that understood the skills that Macon had, but it was also really generous that Macon kind of pushed this beyond just a kind of to-do list and into something that informed her practice. And as the project kind of wound down for final exhibitions and sort of reflections on how the project went for the artists involved, this becomes a bit of like a seed in my brain about like, okay, this would be interesting to do in other iterations. And certainly, I think in the ideal model, and I'll talk to you now about Neighborhood Time Exchange in Prince George, in Canada, this would be my proposition, right? Is that in Canada, it seems to me that there is enough space, enough empty vacant space that could be redeployed for artist studios that could be offered free of charge, perhaps through like a property tax rebate, so long as that artist is kind of able to find a local community partner to work out of, right? And I would suggest that this, while I'm kind of like technically commissioning, or these projects are commissioned right now, it would be very interesting over time to imagine that this is just like, let's just decide to do this, and I don't need to be involved. But so in Prince George, which is a very it's sort of the capital of northern BC, it's also received artists but now one at a time. In Philadelphia, they were kind of in cohorts. Now one artist or artist group goes up at a time, and they're paired with one community partner. So rather than people coming in and kind of be able to ask for anything, we found a kind of anchor organization that could have, that needs some help kind of getting something off the ground, and the artists can kind of more readily work on projects with them. So Rachel and Sarah, who were the first artists, kind of walk into this storefront space, and they have a sculptural practice. But they connect with these guys called the Downtown Ambassadors, and they're recently paroled citizens, and they are kind of they're trying to get new work skills. So they partnered with them to actually renovate some of the studio. They went and had lots of community meetings with people talking about what projects needed to be done, and they settled on a couple that sort of came out of the work that they were doing in their studio. Which I'll also note that this is kind of amazing in Prince George, which is a very small community. And it has Two Rivers Gallery, so to have a kind of another art space that is bringing people out who maybe haven't encountered contemporary art before is very exciting. And it's actually already begun to open up the possibility that they want to kind of start up their own artist-run center after that project kind of wraps up, which I think is very interesting to imagine that a project becomes a seed for something like that. So they did like jurying for kind of like youth arts projects. They worked a lot with balloons to collaborate with this Rivers Day project that celebrates the two rivers up there. And these kind of like sculptural works become obviously reference points into their own practice, but also these things that actually really contribute to the community organization that's running the projects. This was in collaboration with the Downtown Prince George Business Improvement Association, and they wanted a kind of a public gathering place, so they decided that kind of creating this sort of, there's a small blue stage in this line that goes up across the building. So these works are really compelling points of how artists can have their practice, but also contribute in really kind of visible ways to a community that isn't instrumentalizing one over the other. Lily Mead Martin, she was the artist in residence in October, and Two Rivers Gallery needed a new deck on their sculpture garden on the top of the roof, and so she had some building skills that she helped to do this, and it's going to be a really actually important piece of infrastructure for the gallery for like probably at least a decade until they need to redeck it again. And her work is much about kind of drawing and spatial navigation through through this sort of representation. And she had a number of kind of public moments where she talked a lot about her own practice, which drew out local artists in a way that maybe that kind of support hadn't been there before. So also bringing artists in become a catalyzing force in a way where the community was already there, they just needed sort of like an excuse to get together. And that's really, you know, so all of these things are kind of unraveling as like, this is Caitlin, who's the curatorial assistant in Lily, and they gave like a guided tour of some of Lily's work in a way where she was saying that this guy had earlier in the residency given her a really hard time about like, you know, this art, like this doesn't look like art, and I don't think that art really is like, why are you doing that up here? You know, and by the end of the residency, like they had like a long discussion about what was going on. So it's a community, I think in smaller communities, and certainly where I grew up, this was the case where it's like you can get to know a huge range of people, some of whom are very much behind what you're doing, and some of whom may be indifferent, and some of whom may be openly disinterested in supporting you. But it's the ability for those communities to be changed together over time by these kind of like, you know, Darren O'Donnell describes it as like social acupuncture, right? It's these moments of kind of like releasing certain points of tension. And it doesn't hurt that it's now like a free music venue as well, every Tuesday night, and that's good for the community too. So I'll just say, I'll whip through a couple more projects here. The Academy of Tactical Resistance is also like a small community that kind of crops up. And it takes the form of a sort of, I guess, of an academy interested in looking at everyday forms of resistance. And it crops up in gallery spaces to sort of ask, like, how are we already participating in points of resistance or points of kind of disruption in ways that take up sort of like known symbols, but also start to ask questions about how we are together. So if you participated in the workshop yesterday, I enjoy these kind of interview booklet forums, and these kind of workshops run throughout the Academy of Tactical Resistance and create communities kind of spontaneously. And this kind of like small community work is also something that, beyond just like regional small communities, communities that come together based on a kind of a certain provocation are also very much, I think, they're certainly at the core of my practice, but I think they become a different way to ask something of one another. Projects that are participatory, asking people to make decisions publicly, these kinds of things are really, I think, exemplary of how we might begin to be together in communities that that are kind of, you know, could handle an expansion of the role that arts takes. So this looks probably a lot like a kind of cultural asset mapping thing, if you've ever participated in that, or kind of like consulting, community consulting thing. But these statements are all kind of a bit tricky. They have a certain kind of immediate meaning, perhaps, but you have a supplementary book that sort of like complicates what each of these texts say. And sort of importantly, you kind of, I guess, vote or make a decision in front of other people. And kind of modeling this disagreement in public is really interesting, because I think that when we talk about sort of like community, we imagine that means that like we're coming together, we're trying to build consensus, we're trying to do something that's like positive. But actually a more interesting version of like community or a democratic space might be one in which we could more openly actually engage in conflict or disagreement in a way that isn't like unsafe, but is actually like a core understanding that like we are not going to get along. And when I'm talking, it means that you are not able to talk. And that's a negotiation, right? And that's a point of conflict. If we can start to do that better, I think we might get to a more interesting place of thinking about that small communities and community engaged work doesn't mean that you need to kind of absolve yourself of any kind of like political rooting or any kind of like interest in saying things that are difficult to say sometimes. And finally, I'll talk about the School for Eventual Vacancy, which comes out of, this was something that was written on the walls at Emily Carr when I first got there, and I was kind of like, I was teaching foundation, it was like the end of the semester, and I feel like this is a question we certainly ask ourselves over the course of any number of activities, but certainly it's poignant for students to be asking this. And I had this idea kind of in parallel to that part of the challenge of institutions is that you kind of get really rigid articulations of kind of power, and those come through like leadership roles, and even if they kind of rotate, the challenge is that they all presume that those roles need to continue to exist, right? And even the idea of a school is kind of challenged by the fact that it sort of operates in some ways just to allow itself to continue to exist. And I wondered what a school would look like that didn't have that kind of underlying interest or mandate. So I started the School for Eventual Vacancy, which runs kind of as an itinerant, kind of like glorified reading group sometimes. And it doesn't look a lot different than art and design courses that I teach or that I have been a part of. But crucially, we all are agreeing there to share power in certain ways, which is that if you have come for the first time, and I said this briefly yesterday, but if you come to the School for Eventual Vacancy the first time, we have a kind of a bit of a declaration that we read at the beginning that describes if you're here for the first time, there may not be much opportunity for you to talk, right? And that's kind of by design. And if you come a second time, then you're qualified to teach. And at the end of every gathering, we have to all decide if the school needs to continue to exist or not. And if anyone says no, then it stops, and it's on recess right now because I guess we couldn't decide if it needed to end or not. There was some imagination that we might eventually need to have outdoor boxing classes again, or I guess kind of like DIY beer can bowling. But this kind of like way to imagine that school is a place that isn't work and isn't leisure, but is a kind of third space of social gathering that's about kind of like doing something together, but without a really definitive outcome. That's an interesting social space for me to continue to want to certainly be in and articulate. We remade Monopoly so that it was anti-capitalist and you could buy properties, but you had to develop them for social purpose. And you had to decide over time if you were going to like basically buy out the community center next to your kind of park because you decided that the youth needed a bigger skate park or something, right? So these kinds of negotiations that repurpose how we are together, I think they become, this is an interesting framework, I would say. And we wrapped up the sessions this summer meeting out in Crab Park, and this was, it's kind of like, I want to spend more time doing this, right? And I think that this, as a legible community that doesn't need to like service or do things for other people, is a really like viable way, because it's difficult to scale things up to a place where you are kind of actively assuming that what you're doing is good for the people around you when they don't have an opportunity to input into the project. And also, I'm more interested in like there being like 50 school for eventual vacancies or whatever other people want to do with them than everybody coming to mine, right? And so that's something that is challenging in smaller communities, like regional communities, but I think it's something worth thinking about. So finally, 5 propositions. Okay, I think artists working in public need not conform to existing publics. I think that this is something that my work continues to try and like cultivate, is that we can find new ways of being in public together. Communities might be even smaller than we normally consider them to be. I would argue again that we probably don't want to expect that there's like one thing that serves everybody, but that we all might need to build up one another's capacity to be kind of self-defining how we want to work together or not work together. I think art can do a lot of things, but measurably solving big problems is probably not one of them. I think this is a kind of uninteresting role that art is sometimes asked to take on. And I would say that anything in my work that looks like it's trying to solve a problem is probably not trying to do that, but it's trying to like basically propose something inconvenient in the moment, right? And I appreciate being in that space. I think artists are especially good at finding ways to make things more complicated, and this is what makes them super valuable in kind of other roles, because they can complicate other forms of kind of organization. And finally, the future of meaningful and long-term engagement is probably not in major urban centers. And I really believe this, because there are things that are possible in smaller regional communities that are just like, they could not exist for any number of either financial or sort of kind of like political reasons in larger cities. And having, again, grown up in a very small community where like, I knew the guy who's now mayor was like, used to work at Shoppers Drug Mart, and I knew him there, and then he was also like the editor of the paper. It's like that kind of thing where over time, you build up very deep relationships that in a city are harder because people seem to come and go at a different pace. So I think that the most exciting stuff, I would argue, is going to be happening outside of Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal in the next 10 or 15 years. And I think that from what I heard this morning, even the kind of like policy-driven stuff you guys are talking about is like hugely exciting, and I was really happy to hear about some of that. So that's all I'll say. Thank you very much for listening, and any questions, let me know.